Over many decades, people of color have been forgotten and abused. Now, globally and nationally, movements such as hashtag Black Lives Matter have been popping up all over the nation. With these, many people are claiming that white privilege no longer exists. I'm your host, Kacie Brooks, and this is That Discussion. Welcome to Spotcast. Since we all agree that it exists, how do you think white privilege has affected your communities?
So I really haven't noticed it much, but I guess something like an example could be when my parents go to like communities populated with mostly white people, they tend to get a lot of weird stares and everything. So I guess that could be like a little example.
I don't really know how it's affected my community, but I've heard it said that privilege is invisible to those who have it. So there's likely like a lot of things that go on around me that I just don't notice because I have this privilege.
I agree with you that it's invisible. I take the light rail every day, and the thing that I've noticed is that I hardly ever get my pass checked, yet I see security yelling at or confronting people of color because of their passes, and I just get off free.
So, with this being said, to go off of what August was saying, how do you guys think you use your white privilege without knowing?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of not something I really notice a lot because I don't get the discrimination of it. But I imagine, there's a fear that people of color have just being able to sort of exist and like just be in many situations that I don't have because I don't have to have those experiences, because I'm of the color of my skin.
So, with that being said, how do you think you are given white privilege without knowing that you even have it in the first place?
Anyone who has lighter skin, or who is white, can experience privilege. And it's not really something that is given to you, it's just something you're born with.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, it's not necessarily the privilege that is given, but it's more so like things you can be given because of this privilege. Just, different opportunities and just a sort of a lack of negative feelings or fear of certain things because like these people have some sort of bias towards people of other skin colors.
So, I agree with that. There's a lot of bias and there's a lot of unknown that go into it. So, how do you think schools can educate you and other students on white privilege?
I think it's important not to sugarcoat things and to just be honest. For example, in a lot of textbooks, Christopher Columbus is painted as an amazing hero or someone who discovered America, but that's not the reality. In reality, he was horrible to indigenous people. And I just think that educators should be more honest with their students.
I feel like it's also important that when educating others, we make sure we're raising up the voices of people of color who have had these experiences, with discrimination towards them, to make sure that like we're getting stories from the source and to make sure that like everyone can better understand what they have to go through.
Personally, in my opinion, I don't only think it's a responsibility of our educators, but also our parents. When we're children, we're really oblivious of these things, and if we're not introduced to these things at an earlier age, it's going to be a really long process of getting the gist of how things were. For example, when we were children, we were always taught that Christopher Columbus was a great man, and now like when we're getting older, we realize no, that's not true.
So maybe that's a good example of how white privilege can be used for good and for bad, which leads me into my next question. How do you think people can use white privilege for good and also for bad?
I read an article about a student who went to her guidance counselor about applying for colleges, and she was told by the guidance counselor, and other students of color were told not to apply for top tier schools. And white students were encouraged to apply for top-tier schools?
So I think it could be used for good. For example, there was like this news article, like a news report, and it was basically just talking about how there was this African American man, and it was a situation with a police officer, and the police officer was really violent with the African American man, but then came a white woman and stepped between them, and that really made the officer become more calm, and it really calmed down the situation, which I feel like that's a really good way to use your white privilege, so you can help out people of color when they're in a potentially dangerous situation and being discriminated just for their skin color.
So, with that being said, especially in schools, what barriers do you think that you don't have to overcome by not being a minority?
So I can't speak for people like this, but I think one of the biggest things and one of the most obvious things that we've been talking throughout this podcast is you don't have to be worried about being treated differently because of your skin color.
Yeah, I think it's sort of that suspicion that some people have, of people of color. There's a lot of stereotypes about just people of color in general, and I don't have to deal with those stereotypes, whereas other people do.
I don't have to deal with a fear of law enforcement, and us all being high school students, I have the privilege of getting disciplined less than students of color.
All throughout this podcast, we talked about white privilege, how it affects us, how it affects our schools, and how it affects people of color throughout history. Again, I'm your host, Kacie Brooks. Thank you for listening, and this is Spotcast.